we talk about life expectancy increasing, but there's also an issue of healthy life expectancy versus total life expectancy.
Han, you are the former head of institutional investors at the World Economic Forum, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Han, I've seen you speak brilliantly before about what I think you and others call the pension time bomb, and I wanted to just ask a little bit about the way we are saving today. I mean, even like 20 or 30 years ago, I remember there being real concern that the life expectancy was increasing, yet the entire retirement age was staying where it was. So can you speak a bit about what the issue is? The issue still as big today as it was? Is it getting bigger? And what are governments trying to do about it?
Absolutely. I think one of the key areas that we wrote about in terms of a report at while I was at the forum, looking at the pension crisis, is the fact that you take age 65 retirement, which is fairly ubiquitous around the world these days. That number was derived, let's take the United States. Back in 1935, Social Security set a retirement age of age 65, and that was back in 1935.
I didn't know that. That retirement age was set almost 100 years ago.
Yes, and back then life expectancy was only 62. So we weren't even expected to live until retirement. And I'm going to break into some actuarial speak, but the conditional mortality, if you made it to age 65, was only a few years. So a lot of pensions and retirement income was only intended to provide a few years of additional income in retirement.
It sounds like life insurance then was a very profitable business because most people were dead before retirement.
Yeah, so taking a broader step back, the idea that when we're children, we're dependent on our parents, and then when we become adults, we contribute to society and we're rewarded by a salary as a result. And then in retirement, really is only the last few years where you then enjoy the fruits of your labor, and then you enjoy those savings. But nowadays, we're living, life expectancy has increased so much in developed and developing parts of the world, which is causing a huge burden on pension systems that weren't designed to do that.
Now, is the burden both in the private sector and the public sector? And the reason I bring this up is actually my father used to work for British Airways, and they had what was a defined benefit pension scheme. Now, we think about that today, it seems crazy because you're basically promising a return to people 20 or 30 years in front and effectively creating unnecessary liabilities. So can you speak a bit about how the private sector is doing pensions between DC and DB and the public sector?
Yeah, this gets a little complicated, and I'm going to take a more nuanced position. There's definitely been a shift away from traditional defined benefit pensions like your father had to defined contribution systems around the world. I think one of the key areas, if you look at traditional defined benefit plans, from the individual's perspective, there were a lot of advantages because the investment risk, a lot of the the security there, you get lifetime pensions. You basically receive a pension payment until you die. But I was trying to find a nicer way to say that. But all of that is on either the government or the plan sponsor, as you will, like the company, the private sector company, or the government to provide those promises and those benefits. When the shift occurred to defined contribution, it basically, in effect, shifted investment risk, longevity risk, everything over to the individual. So now individuals with, take 401k plans in the United States, or
that would be the classic defined contribution scheme.
Correct, yeah. So if you look at defined contribution schemes around the world, a lot of it is individual accounts, which is good in a lot of ways, but then the burden of choosing your investments and managing that money, and especially managing that money upon retirement, if it provides a lump sum, all of that burden shifts on the individual. And for people like you and I in the business, who are let's just say a little bit more financially savvy, that may not be an issue. But I have good friends who are very well educated, doctors and lawyers, but their finance is just not something that they have studied or trained in, and that becomes something more of a burden in another way, because then now all of that is incumbent on them. Now, if they can afford to have financial advisors, that's a different story. But if you look at the broader population, you look at people who are self-employed, for example, there's a lot of things then with the gig economy. A lot of our reports highlighted issues there where it's hard to have a traditional defined contribution plan when people are self-employed or in the gig economy space. So that's really, that's why I say I adopted more nuanced view in terms of the benefits and disadvantages of defined benefit versus defined contribution.
The standard model has been basically kind of work at a particular company, build up savings, and then it all comes to an end at 60 or 65, and then you retire.
Yeah.
So firstly, why has that retirement age not changed over the, last 100 years? And then secondly, why does it have to be so black and white? I mean, I just think that, in this day and age when people can work longer past that age, why isn't there a sort of more of a tapering off? Like, why do we have to think in such black and white terms?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer the first part of the question first, why has retirement age not changed? And the answer is it's just politically very difficult, unfortunately. Mathematically, it's actually a very simple problem. People are living longer, and we should work longer as a result. It's actually quite simple from that perspective. But politically, it is a very difficult thing to do. If you take,
but it's never going to get any better, because if people keep living longer and they all have as equal a vote as the young, then are they going to continue to not vote for a later retirement age, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I would say that this is it's a bit of a weakness. I would say I'm not gonna, I would say humans in general are not so good with long-term planning. Everyone's more concerned of short-term.
Yeah.
So if I am running for office in a Western-style democracy and I say, vote for me, and I'm going to make sure you work longer and you have to work longer. Instead of you thought you would retire at 65, you're going to retire at 70 now. And
doesn't sound as appealing.
Exactly. And so that does not tend to get votes. And so, and especially if my term in office is only for the next 4 years. It's unfortunately more politically expedient to ignore the issue and kick it down the line, and that's been done for a long time. There's actually another interesting factor about raising retirement age, though, and Japan has actually encountered this. So I had some interesting discussions with a very good academic in one of the Japanese think tanks, and she pointed out in Japan, they've only recently increased their retirement age from, I believe, 62 to 65. And if you think about the life expectancy there, it's increased far more than a lot of the Western countries. But the reason why they've had such difficulty raising the retirement age is because, demographically speaking, they're already in an inverted situation where they have a smaller amount of younger people and a larger amount of older people. And if the older people do not retire, it leaves even less room for younger workers to move up within the organizations, within companies, within society. So that is actually something that they're very aware of in terms of the development. And if those young people leave, it exacerbates the problem. So that is actually a consideration for them in looking at why they haven't raised the retirement age even more. Now, to the second part of your question, I think in terms of why is it so black and white, I think that's absolutely the right question to ask. I think we're at a point where we need to re-examine the future of retirement, and this whole idea that I'm done working and I'm going to stop and that's it.
I'm telling you for a fact, my parents have a lot of time on their hands, and I would love it if they had something to do instead of bothering me.
I think I think Singapore actually has a great model. So I was speaking to some people from the ministry there, and we were looking at solutions from around the world and what different countries that have done that are innovative. And they've adopted a model where they are looking to their elderly to serve in elder statesmen's role, like advisors and mentors, so they can still, it's retirement per
roles.
se, but yeah, they can have paid roles where they can use their experience and expertise and still guide the younger generation. The younger generation can still move up within the organizations, but the elder statesmen can still impart their knowledge and experience in areas that are still relevant and still matter. And I think that is something that is definitely, kind of addresses what you said. It's no longer a black and white, clear cut, I stopped working at this age. You can still serve a function. If we go back to what I mentioned originally, the purpose of what this serves in society, you can still be contributing to society, to business, and all of that in something that takes advantage of that expertise.
I'm sure there's a link with that and general happiness as well, because I think getting a little bit more profound here, but like having purpose like generally leads to a happier life.
Yeah.
And if you're retiring at 65 and you've still got 20 or 30 years, it's not like you've got 5 or 10, and then that's a long time to be not generating income for the economy.
While I was at the World Economic Forum, we published a report called "We'll Live to 100, How Can We Afford It?" I'm a big fan of that title, and I credit the media team, working with the media team on that, because it's a much catchier title than the impact of longevity risk on pension liabilities. But it's pithy, but it gets to the point of like, this is the problem we're all facing, and it's relatable. We're living so much longer, and how does that impact our lives and our ability to afford those lifestyles? I think one key area actually that wasn't covered when we were originally doing those reports, that I've been a little bit more focused now, is there's we talk about life expectancy increasing, but there's also an issue of healthy life expectancy versus total life expectancy, because you can contribute when in the periods of the healthy life expectancy, but at the same time, and not to get a little bit more depressing here, but because we're living so much longer, there's also things like cognitive decline now and physical decline.
People are sort of basically dying slower, which is a burden on health systems.
Yeah. So traditional financial planning and traditional retirement models assume that our expenses would be less in retirement because our houses are paid off, the children are grown up, and you require less income. But you go past a certain point now, and all of a sudden, healthcare needs, those things can increase if you need additional care because of other conditions that pop up because of the greater life expectancy. So that is, so there is, I think, a distinction between increased total life expectancy versus increased healthy life expectancy. And again, what I brought up earlier with Singapore about the elder statesman model, that works very well for white collar positions. But the issue of raising retirement age also becomes a little more nuanced when you're talking about, physical labor, more blue-collar roles where you physically can't work past a certain age unless you transition to something. Now, that's not to say the model can't work, because they can still, again, they have decades of experience, they can still use that experience in other positions, but probably not, lifting boxes or manual labor type of roles.
So you mentioned Singapore as possibly a pioneer in this kind of world. Are there any other countries where you admire their retirement system and what they're doing?
Yeah, so to address one thing you brought up earlier, this whole, again, if we look at defined benefit and defined contribution, I mentioned I adopted a more nuanced view because there were advantages and disadvantages to both. One of the key advantages of defined contribution plans as opposed to traditional defined benefit plans is, in traditional defined benefit plans, a lot of the time, current workers are paying for, in effect, funding the retirement of current retirees, which is sustainable when you have a growing workforce, but not as sustainable when you have a shrinking population, which is the case in a lot of parts of the world right now, including China. They are actually going to be where Japan is because of the one-child policy that has now been rescinded, but you have a gap in effect because as the current working population ages, in another 20 years, they will be where Japan is right now, with a inverted pyramid.
Well, I was actually reading something that was even more alarming than that, or possibly alarming, which was, I may have got this wrong, but they said there's 500 million farmer families in China, which is enormous, and they went from having, whatever it is, something like 2 children or 1.5 children to like 0.8, and that's even more of a burden, because it's not only there's less of a workforce, there's less people basically doing agriculture and producing food. So it seems like a double whammy.
Absolutely. So actually, the Chinese government is very focused on the pensions issue. I know they've been working with various different other countries and learning from their models in order to see what they can apply to address this longer term issue in their country. Back to the original point about defined benefits versus defined contributions. What defined contribution plans do very well, if we look at pensions from an accumulation phase and a decumulation phase. So when the accumulation phase is the savings while you're working, and defined contribution plans, by having individual accounts, it puts the accountability on you, the individual, to save for yourself or share in the savings, whether it's the employer kicking in some portion and you kicking in some portion, the government kicking in some portion. But that individual account building is very powerful. Where it's not as good, as I mentioned earlier, is the decumulation phase, when you're actually in retirement. And one of the reasons is that from a purely numerical perspective, it's less efficient. If I have if you have let's just say £1 million at retirement, is that enough? And it's not an easy question to answer, because the answer is it depends.
Depends where you live, what your standard of living is.
Yeah, do you have others to take care of, and your lifestyle, all of that, and how long you live for. And all of those things, are go into that calculation. How much are you spending? And, if you think you're going to live to 80 and you live to 95, that's a very different calculation. So a lot of studies from around the world have found that, a lot of people tend to underspend, and so it's economically inefficient in a lot of ways. There's a lot of and that those savings then pass on to their heirs, but they could have been living, spending more money while in retirement. So I would say like a country like the Netherlands, where they have this, they call it a collective defined contribution arrangement, where you pool the money up and pool the longevity risk for retirees. That is actually a more economically efficient system. And I think my own thought on that is that we need to be moving more to a system like that, because that will help solve this gap that we have between what we've saved versus what we need in order to have sufficient income in retirement for all.
Well, Han, this has been such an interesting discussion. I've loved hearing your insights, and again, thank you very much.
Great, thank you for having me.